How imminent is China's invasion of Taiwan? This is one of the questions that has been repeated by far the most in recent months. And keep in mind that the President of the United States himself wanted to make his position clear.
Biden. US forces would defend Taiwan if China invades. President Joe Biden said the US would defend Taiwan if there was an unprecedented attack.
For the moment, however, after the first face-to-face meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, which took place on 14th of November 2022, during the G20 summit in Indonesia, Washington's impression is that this invasion will not take place anytime soon, which of course does not dispel the doubts about what may happen in a few years' time.
US Navy chief warns China could invade Taiwan before 2024.
However, let's take a moment, VisualPolitik viewers, because although all eyes are on the island of Formosa, the conflict in the region could be ignited by a totally different clash. Xi Jinping's regime not only intends to take over Taiwan, but to become the dominant power in the entire Asia-Pacific region. And for that, it has to overcome one huge obstacle. I am, of course, talking about the influence of the United States of America. And before I go on, I would like to ask you a question. Which is the United States' greatest ally in the region? We could talk about Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan itself. However, the country closest to Washington in terms of politics, economy, and culture is none other than Australia. And in a way, this is what explains news stories like this.
Australia attacks China's policy of economic punishment at the World Trade Organization, accuses it of contravening rules. Australia Prime Minister seeks end to China's trade sanctions.
In recent years, relations between China and Australia have gone from bad to worse. From being good partners, they have become two sides practically at loggerheads, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There have been constant clashes on both sides. However, in May 2022, something changed. The Labour Party took over the Australian government, and among their priorities is to seek a better relationship, precisely with Xi Jinping's China. We've talked about this in a past video here on VisualPolitik. However, that doesn't mean the storm has abated, not at all. Australia is one of the most economically successful countries in recent decades, making it one of the wealthiest countries with the highest quality of life in the world. It is also a strong democracy with a thriving civil society and attracts many immigrants who dream of a better life. That's why issues like freedom and human rights matter in Australia, and they matter more and more. And perhaps because of that, and because of its close relationship with the United States of America, this country, in one way or another, is doomed to clash with Beijing. Or rather, Canberra has become a nuisance for Xi Jinping, and that is not likely to change. And precisely this point has recently led many analysts to ask a question that is as clear as it is disruptive. What if the conflict between China and the West started in Australia instead of Taiwan? Of course, we're not talking about the soldiers of the so-called Chinese People's Liberation Army trying to plant their flag in the Australian outback. That is, in that arid, dusty, endless reddish desert that forms the heart of the Aussie nation. No, we don't need to talk about that. We'll leave that possibility to Netflix. The risk on the table is very different, but at the same time, just as menacing. VisualPolitik viewers, could China blockade Australia? Well, let's take a look.
The Australian Dream.
Australia is a formidably rich country, richer than we could ever imagine. For example, it has the 9th highest GDP per capita in the world, and the 7th highest median household income in the OECD. But not only that, the most important thing of all is that its economy is a real rock. Australia has virtually no unemployment. 73% of Australians aged 15 to 64 have a job, and since 1992, the Australian economy has had only 1 year of crisis. Of course, I'm talking about 2020, the year of the coronavirus. But not even the pandemic was able to slow down this country. By the first quarter of 2021, recovery was already a fact, and its GDP was higher than it had been just before the pandemic.
The Australian economy is on a positive path. Output is now above its pre-pandemic level, and more Australians have a job than before the pandemic. Philip Lowe, Governor of Australia's Central Bank.
And perhaps the key point, its system has savings equivalent to about 170% of the entire GDP. In other words, Australia sits on a gigantic amount of money ready to finance all kinds of projects. So the fact is that between one thing and another, to put this all into perspective, the average net wealth of an Australian household is about $530,000 US. Yes, that's correct. More than $500,000. And of course, with such data, it should come as no surprise that this is precisely the OECD country that attracts the most skilled immigrants and is 7th in the world for signing up the most entrepreneurs each year. Nor that, according to the OECD, it is 2nd on the list for countries with the best living conditions, including the 3rd best health system in the world. In a nutshell, it's what you might call the Australian dream. In fact, do you know what one of Australia's biggest economic problems is right now? Well, take a look.
Australia needs foreign backpackers to return. It is facing some of the rich world's worst labour shortages. Labour shortage threatens Australia's post-pandemic resurgence. Unemployment has hit a near 50-year low, but companies are struggling to find workers.
Who wouldn't want to live in Australia? Well, take note, because despite everything, the best for the Aussie nation could be yet to come. Do you know why? Well, basically because of the energy transition and electrification plans being promoted by governments around the world. Electric cars, wind turbines, solar panels, batteries. All these products need minerals such as cobalt, nickel, lithium, and copper to be manufactured. We've talked about this on VisualPolitik. The change is so profound that according to World Bank estimates, the production of these materials will have to be multiplied by 6 to be able to respond to the huge demand that is emerging. And you will probably say, but let's see, Josh, what does all this have to do with Australia? Well, the land of the kangaroos and koalas is fast becoming one of the most geostrategically important countries on the planet. Australia is not only the world's largest, or one of the world's largest, producers of gold, iron ore, coal, zinc, and bauxite. It is also a superpower in all these new materials that are now suddenly in demand like there's no tomorrow. Australia has one of the world's 3 largest reserves of nickel, cobalt, lithium, and copper. In fact, it is already the world's largest lithium producer and the 2nd largest cobalt producer. In addition, the country also has enormous deposits of rare earths, which makes it an alternative to China itself. And no, we're not even done yet. As if all this were not enough, Australia is also the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. Yes, that fuel that half the world is currently fighting over. And it also has the largest reserves of low-cost uranium in the world, which could be tremendously lucrative now that nuclear energy is coming back into fashion. In other words, Australia is not only a formidably rich country with a huge financial sector, as well as being a tourism and industrial powerhouse, it is also one of the key countries in everything to do with the energy transition. In other words, you may not have known about this, but every time you talk about climate change, you're basically talking about new business and new revenue for Australia. So, I don't know, we could almost say that this country has been blessed. But wait a minute, remember the question we asked at the beginning of the video? Could China blockade Australia? Well, this happens to be the latest challenge facing Canberra. Australia has an Achilles heel, and now they have to remedy it so that China cannot take advantage of it. Do you want to know what exactly we are talking about? Well, listen up.
The koala facing the dragon.
China is Australia's largest trading partner. Practically 30 to 40% of all of the country's exports goes to the Asian giant. In fact, the relationship between the two countries was so good that in 2014, Xi Jinping gave a speech in the Australian Parliament where he received a great applause. That same year, the two countries signed an ambitious free trade agreement. However, in 2017, it all started to fall apart. In 2018, Australian authorities began legislating to curb China's increasing interference in the country's politics. In 2018, for security reasons, Huawei was excluded from the development of the 5G network. Later, Australia demanded respect for human rights in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And in the end, the Australian government even called for an investigation into China's responsibility for the evolution and spread of SARS coronavirus 2. All this caused enormous anger in Beijing, which was quick to respond with punishments of all kinds. Let's just say that China stopped picking up the phone, suspended high-level political meetings, and instead, punishments in the form of tariffs and blockades were put in place against many Australian products, from timber to wine, coal, lobster, and agricultural products. Of course, Chinese tourism was also stopped in its tracks. In 2020, there was also a large-scale cyber attack against Australia. China was not directly blamed, but there was no need either. Things seemed very clear. Most recently, on the 19th of April, the Chinese government signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands. Thanks to this agreement, China could have the ability to reach and monitor Australian waters. And you know what? This is exactly what we're talking about. Australia is not only the main ally of the United States in the region, but also, as we've seen, a key player in the global economy, thanks to its enormous mineral and energy reserves. But as we mentioned, it could have an Achilles heel, a serious weak point. With its growing navy and air force, China could be able to disrupt and block the shipping lanes of Australian trade. And take note, because right now, this is clearly the greatest risk to national security, and if necessary, the greatest blackmail tool that Beijing could have. Soon, you will understand why. And pay close attention. We're not only talking about the interruption of exports and imports, but about something potentially much more serious. You see, Australia has a rare status in world energy markets. It is both an importer and an exporter. Let me explain. The country is consuming more oil than ever. It produces less than it did a decade ago. Its emergency reserves are at rock bottom, and it is running out of capacity to produce fuels. Whereas in 2000, the country had 8 refineries that supplied the entire domestic market. Today, it has only 2. The result? Increasing dependence on foreign countries. Although Australia continues to export some oil, it imports 90% of the gasoline it consumes, mainly from countries such as South Korea, Singapore, Japan, Malaysia, and Taiwan. Well, if it comes to it, according to an analysis commissioned by the Australian Ministry of Defence, China could lock down the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and thus block most of Australia's fuel supply, or at best, force tankers to take much longer and more costly routes. All of this could cripple the Australian economy in just a few weeks. And it doesn't end there. In addition, Australia is perhaps the Western country that is most dependent on China for the supply of key products and components for its industry, from fertilizers and salicylic acid to aluminium to all kinds of chemical compounds and machinery. In other words, in the face of a new crisis, China could respond by trying to blockade the Australian economy, and that could unleash a huge geopolitical and military storm with a country that is increasingly important to the global economy. And this helps explain news stories like this.
Over 60% of Australians say that China is more of a security threat to Australia than an economic partner. That is a spectacular reversal. In 2018, the figure was only 12%.
Now, does this mean that Australia is at the mercy of Beijing's schemes? Well, obviously not. Australia has 3 major advantages. It is a very rich country. It is the best ally of the United States in the region, and they are now taking the China threat seriously. So, in recent years, we have seen Canberra strengthen its bilateral security ties with other countries in the area, particularly Japan. We have seen how alliances such as the Quad, the Five Eyes, and the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework have been strengthened. We've already talked about all of these here on VisualPolitik. But above all, we have seen how the alliance with the United States has been strengthened to the point of signing the AUKUS program with the United States and the United Kingdom, a kind of alliance that will see Australia spend more than $100 billion equipping itself with nuclear submarines, hypersonic missiles, Tomahawk missiles, and achieving greater integration with allied armies. Strengthening relations with the United States has a very clear potential outcome. If China tries to blockade Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia could block the supply of oil from the Middle East to the Asian giant by cutting these 3 waterways you see on screen. Because this happens to be one of China's greatest weaknesses. So I am sure you will now understand better why Australia is still so interested in standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States. For the time being, if one thing is clear, it is that China's economic sanctions have been a failure. Recently, after 6 long years, Xi Jinping has met again with an Australian Prime Minister to try to improve things. But if one thing is clear, it is that nothing will ever be the same again. Perhaps China underestimated the great strengths of Australia, a country that has become the destination of choice for millionaires, entrepreneurs, and immigrants of all kinds. The conflict with China has perhaps changed Australian politics and society forever. It has made them look like a powerhouse, and now that is exactly what they're starting to become. They certainly have the money, resources, and influence to do so. But having reached this point, it's your turn. Do you think the conflict with the West could start in Australia and not in Taiwan? What role do you think Australia will play in international politics over the next few years? And the most important question of all, would you like to live the Australian dream and live in this country? I know I would. Leave us your answer in the comments. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Once again, thank you so much for being there. All the best. See you next time.